can.
Hi, can you
Yes,
hear
how are
me?
you? I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, nice to meet you. Oh, here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
Would you like to say hi in Chinese to the audience here today?
Okay. 大家好.
Hi, 大家给点掌声.
How do?
So, why you chose this topic to share with us?
Why did I choose this topic? I think, as I plan to talk about, I think it's something that's been kind of very important for the crypto space, especially in the last year or two. And I think as we're trying to just build more and more things that actually try to do useful and interesting things for people, and as the systems that we try to build are becoming more complex, I think. It's just becoming clear that finding ways to do kind of decentralized governance in a way that is kind of fair and kind of unexploitable and open and all of those nice things is very important.
Mhm. Thank you. So, the stage is yours. Cheers.
Okay. Just remind me, how long do I have again?
Uh, you should have like 40 minutes.
40. Okay,
Yeah,
perfect. I
go
will.
ahead.
Oh, you have disabled my ability to share the screen. Is that intentional? Um,
Uh, yeah, maybe you can try.
okay. No, yeah, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. Um, hmm.
So you're using the Chinese version of Zoom?
I- I'm just using Zoom. I guess. I mean, okay.
Okay.
Decentralized governance share. Okay. Do you see
Okay,
this?
we got it. Okay.
Okay.
Okay,
Excellent.
thank you.
Great. Then I will start. So to kind of start off, I will just thought I would just go through a few examples of some interesting things that have happened in the last year. Right. So these are all projects that are on Ethereum. Top left, you have a Compound, a decentralized finance, kind of collateralized lending platform. We have Uniswap launching the Uni token, Synthetics, a synthetic asset platform. Bottom right is a Yearn Finance, a kind of passive investment platform that also does some other things. And one of the interesting things that's happening is that all of these projects are becoming DAOs in some form, right? So Compound is rewriting their protocol in order or designing their protocol so that there is a decentralized autonomous organization, a smart contract that exists on the blockchain, which has the ability to basically make some changes to the smart contracts in the protocol. In the case of Uniswap, they released a token called Uni, and Uni has the right to receive 0.05% of the fee from the trades on Uniswap. And the Uniswap DAO, which Uni token holders can vote in, has the ability to control issuance, and so they can potentially release new versions of the protocol. And Synthetics has their own transition to a decentralized governance. Yearn actually started as being a DAO right from day one, which is very interesting. So these are just some examples of things inside of the Ethereum ecosystem. Outside of the Ethereum ecosystem, Bitcoin Cash has been seeing some debates around an infrastructure funding plan. Basically, there was a proposal for 12.5% of the Bitcoin Cash mining reward to be or I'll say the block reward to be redirected from the way it currently is, which is that it all goes to miners, but to instead go to a group, basically a development team that would hired developers to work on the Bitcoin Cash ecosystem and code base. Zcash started with 80% of the reward going to miners and 20% of the reward going to developers. And the original plan was to switch to 100% miners after 4 years. But they had a series of community decisions and votes, and they made an ultimate decision to continue the 20% of the reward going to developers for another 4 years. Right, so we're seeing even blockchains that initially viewed themselves as being not really having this kind of governance, kind of considering and kind of experimenting with it more and more. And then finally, bottom right, this kind of attempted hostile takeover of the Steam network by our wonderful friend Justin Sun. Basically, the idea is here that he kind of bought Steam, the company, and this basically without the kind of consent of Steam, the community, and tried to kind of assert control over the Steam ecosystem. And when people started voting against some of the things that he was trying to do in the DPoS voting, he basically used coins that were held by exchanges in order to kind of vote and basically vote for himself and try to take over the network. And this ended up being resolved with a fork. So we've been seeing kind of other either blockchains that already have governance have challenges with their governance, or blockchains experimenting with adding more governance. In the case of Bitcoin Cash, the IFP is currently meeting a lot of resistance. And so it's looking, well, it's looking likely that it'll either not go in or some kind of split will happen. I'm not sure. And in Zcash, the 20% actually was extended, and this actually happened very peacefully. Right, so between projects inside of the Ethereum ecosystem and between projects outside of the Ethereum ecosystem, we're seeing a lot of this experimentation with governance, both around protocol changes, but also very importantly around funding happening at the same time. And so we need to ask, well, why is this happening? And I think that there's very good reasons why it's happening, right? So just to kind of zoom out a little bit, the largest problem that the crypto space has is how to fund public goods, right? So the crypto ecosystem, like many things on the internet, depend crucially on public goods, on these projects where somebody does the work once, and once they publish it, there's no way to kind of pick and choose who benefits from it or sell it. Like once you develop it, everyone can access it for free. And for hundreds of years, there's been this known economic challenge around, well, what kind of mechanisms can be used to actually fund these public goods? Before the blockchain space, people attempted to make decentralized projects, but a lot of the time they did not go very well, right? So one major example of this is this attempted Facebook alternative called Diaspora. It raised $200,000 in a crowdfund. At the time, this was a lot of money. I mean, now, of course, even $200 million is not necessarily an extremely large crowdfund. So, we've seen kind of how far we can go if we just basically just add more economic incentives to things. But before we had cryptocurrency and before we had blockchains, we just had these fairly small projects with very few resources. They had a very hard time attracting users, and so they did not go very far. Now Bitcoin came along, right? And Bitcoin, the funding model, maybe for the first 2 years, it was basically a small group of volunteers, and this was enough. But then after that, we've seen Bitcoin-based companies, and you've seen Blockstream. There's a lot of others. And a big part of what happened there is basically developers and early adopters became wealthy. Investment funds that held Bitcoin became wealthy. And so there was this big kind of cloud of wealthy actors that were all just willing to just donate money either directly or indirectly to Bitcoin development. Just because they were large enough that it was in their own interests to contribute some amount. So this model can provide some level of funding, but the reality is that it's still providing a much lower level of funding than potentially is required to make a kind of modern blockchain ecosystem. Ethereum and other blockchains from 2014 to 2018, well, we saw kind of one-time funding, right? So either an ICO or a token sale or a pre-mine where some fixed number of coins basically get printed and directly given to some centralized foundation. And the mindset here is basically that you create this one-time seed funding, and this one-time seed funding would be given to this organization, and this organization would use the funding to develop the protocol. It's worth noting, I think, that at the beginning, pre-mines were very controversial, right? There was this kind of important norm, this kind of idea of purity, this idea that blockchain protocols should be kind of completely fair and completely pure, and that having this rule in the protocol that says, give 100,000 coins to, Bob, the core developer, or give, 200,000 coins to the XYZ Coin Foundation. This felt like a kind of violation of neutrality or a violation of fairness. But in a lot of cases, pragmatism did win out. But I think just because this norm existed and still does exist, there was this pressure to try to say that these ICOs or pre-mines are going to be only one time, right? So we say at the beginning, when a project has to be centralized by necessity, and when we already know that there are only a few core developers starting it, at the beginning, we can just have this one-time kind of violation of this norm of fairness and neutrality, give some coins to this group, distribute it, and then after that, after launch, the protocol can be completely neutral. Now, we, I think, realize that this approach actually has a lot of problems, right? So it has two major problems. One problem is that the benefit going to the foundation or to developers is front-loaded, right? So it all happens at the beginning. And this is bad because, well, if there's a dishonest team that's trying to raise funds, they can just get the money very quickly and they can disappear. Even teams that are not dishonest to start off don't really have much of an incentive to try hard to develop a good project once they have this funding. This is the first problem. The second problem is that many of these projects underestimated just how much work it would take and just how long an amount of time it would take to build a blockchain and how much ongoing effort they would need into the future. And so there really was this idea that you could make a blockchain and finish it. But it turns out that you can't just finish a blockchain so quickly. And there is a need for this ongoing work to keep improving it. So for maybe the first 4 years, right, 2014 to 18, the one-time funding was large enough and crypto prices were rising, everyone was rich and everyone was happy. And so people kind of forgot about this problem for some time. But then after the crypto winter and the bear market of 2019, I think a lot of projects started running out of money. And this problem of how to fund things more sustainably really came to the forefront. It really became something that a lot of people finally realized is a very important problem. So at the beginning of this year, I wrote this blog post on credible neutrality, where I basically tried to describe or interpret this principle that a lot of people have that around basically this idea that blockchains and potentially other systems as well should be fair, right? And the idea is that they should be designed in such a way that you can clearly see that they do not favor any specific participants, right? So like that, my name is not written into the rules of the protocol as a recipient, and these norms around not having pre-mines and not giving funds to centralized foundations, they come out of this principle. But at the same time, that's not the only way to satisfy this principle of credible neutrality, right? One of the points that I made there and that I've made in a lot of other contexts is that potentially there are credibly neutral ways to solve these problems around the tragedy of the commons that normally prevent funding public goods, right? So can we have credibly neutral, credibly fair public goods funding? One other thing that's worth kind of keeping in mind is that, just if you zoom out from an economic point of view, many blockchains' current approach to what issuance is used to fund just doesn't make sense, right? So if you look at just the Ethereum network and this year, right? If you look at just funding that's been going into different categories of public goods, there's one public good which we agree that blockchains are allowed to fund, which is network security, right? Mining and block rewards. And we've been seeing billions of dollars, or about $1 billion, go into block rewards, hundreds of millions of dollars go into transaction fees this year. And so there's about $1.4 billion, I think probably more than 1.5 or 1.6 now, going into securing the Ethereum network. But if we look at just the amount of funding going into research and development, the Ethereum Foundation has an annual budget of about $30 million a year. Other entities in the Ethereum ecosystem, maybe another 30 million. And so there's like 50 or at least 30 times more being spent on network security than is being spent on research and development. And so you have to ask, well, is network security really 30 times more important than research and development? I think the answer is clearly no, right? I think it's pretty clear that if we were able to just take out, like say, 20% of funding from network security, right? So it goes down from 1.4 to around 1.12, cut it down over here, and take that kind of a slice and just move it over to research and development, and you just quadruple the amount of work going into research and development in the Ethereum ecosystem, that on net, this would make Ethereum significantly better, right? Ethereum would benefit much more from a factor of 4 increase in research and development spending than it benefits from the last 20% of its spending on security. So this is kind of the setup, right? So funding public goods other than network security is very important, and we need to figure out how. Another problem that decentralized governance is looking to solve is protocol upgrades, right? So Compound has this approach toward protocol upgrades where they have this administrator address and they have the ability to upgrade the code, but it has a time delay. And so if the governance gets captured and it starts doing things that the users don't like, the users have some window of time within which to withdraw and stop participating. And then Uniswap has a different approach. Basically, if they want to upgrade Uniswap, they just release a new version and they just tell people to move over to it. And people are free to move over to the new version of Uniswap or not move over to it, right? So governance in Uniswap is interesting because the governance of the Uni token only has one capability, which is the capability to issue new units of Uni, which could be used to pay for development. All right, and it has some very limited protocol configuration rights. Like I think it can adjust the fee within some range or something like that, or maybe that's just a planned v3 feature. But in general, right, Uniswap is still, like, despite having some governance, fairly governance minimalist. And even if the governance breaks, like users can just decide to not use some new version. Whereas Compound, it actually uses governance to do upgrades more, but there are some safeguards so that users can protect themselves. So decentralized governance, why aren't we using it ever already, right? And I think a big part of the answer is that decentralized governance actually is vulnerable to attacks. So here's just one fairly simple financial attack on just any coin voting based decentralized governance system. Basically, imagine you have a governance token, right? XYZ. XYZ is a governance token, so it has some economic interest, it has some value. The value goes up because the token collects fees because of something happening in the application, and it also carries governance rights. If you have XYZ, then you can vote. Well, imagine someone creates a wrapper contract that looks like this, right? Anyone can deposit their XYZ into the wrapper contract. Then when they deposit their XYZ, they get a wrapped token, WXYZ. And if they have WXYZ, they can withdraw and then they get XYZ back. But a WXYZ does not have governance rights, right? Governance rights are still owned by the wrapper contract because the wrapper contract is the thing that holds the XYZ. Now, what the wrapper contract does is it auctions the governance power, right? So every time there is a governance decision that token holders need to vote on, the wrapper contract runs an auction. It collects money, and whoever wins the auction gets to choose what all the XYZ in the wrapper contract is voting for. And then the payment from the auction gets distributed as dividends, and it just goes to a WXYZ holders, right? So, look, one simple way to implement this would be that the payments from the auction just gets converted into XYZ, and then the ratio of like how much XYZ you get for each 1 unit of WXYZ just kind of goes up over time, right? So governance power keeps getting auctioned, and holders of XYZ that deposited just keep collecting interest. So what's happening here is it's a kind of separation of economic interest and governance rights. And this is very dangerous, right? The reason why this is very dangerous is basically because most participants or most holders of XYZ are fairly small holders, and so they benefit fully from the economic value of their own XYZ, but the governance decisions that they make with their own small portion of XYZ only have a small effect on the outcome, and they only suffer a small portion of the consequences of any bad outcomes that they contribute to, right? So if, like, for example, there's a governance outcome that does like $100 million of harm to the whole system, but you only have 0.01% of the XYZ, then like that $100 million, first of all, like the amounts that you would lose gets multiplied by 0.01% because you only have 0.01% of the token. But then because you only contribute 0.01% to the governance decision, your incentive to vote correctly gets multiplied by 0.01% again, right? So you start off with 100 million, then divide by 10,000 because you have 1 over 10,000 of the coins, but then divide by 1 over 10,000 again because you have only 1 over 10,000 of the influence on the result. And so the size of your incentive to vote correctly becomes only $1, right? It becomes very tiny and insignificant. And so basically almost everyone has an incentive to participate in this wrapper contract to collect dividends, and then the governance power would be auctioned to a very small number of very wealthy participants, which is not good. One thing I might add is that like this looks like it's a fairly fatal vulnerability, and the thing that I'll show here seems like a fatal vulnerability as well. I think a big part of the reason why a lot of existing decentralized governance projects have not yet been attacked is because their token holdings are very centralized, right? Like in the case of like things like Maker, there's a very small group of people, like some of them are even investment funds that have more than half of all the MKR. In the case of a lot of tokens, like the founders and the foundation and 1 or 2 investors add up to have more than half or more than 2/3. So in practice, like basically a lot of these quote decentralized governance systems that are broken in theory work in practice because they are centralized. And if they were less centralized, they would break. I personally like decentralization and I like things not breaking. And so what I'll talk about later is like, can we make governance mechanisms that do not break even if they are not centralized? Attack number 2. This is a somewhat more evil attack because it's more obfuscated and it doesn't even feel like an attack, right? So here is the attack. So imagine you have a DeFi platform. So like think about Compound, for example, or Maker, or something like this, right? Where you can basically deposit a coin and then withdraw another coin, and you have a CDP, you have this collateralized debt position, where basically, like if you deposit ETH and you get out XYZ, then whenever you send the XYZ back, you can get your ETH back. So here is how the attack works. So step one, deposit your ETH and create the CDP, right? So deposit your ETH into the DeFi platform. You create a CDP, and then from that CDP, from that collateralized debt position, you get XYZ. Now XYZ here is the governance token. Then so you have XYZ. And so you then use the XYZ to do whatever you want in token governance, right? You have native XYZ, you have the ERC20, you can go and vote. After you vote, step 4, return the XYZ to the CDP, and you can recover your ETH. So what is interesting about this, right? What's interesting is that even though you are using XYZ to participate in governance, you actually do not really have any economic exposure to XYZ. Right? If you use your XYZ to make some governance decision, which is very bad and which leads to the platform breaking, then the XYZ becomes worthless. But that XYZ is not really XYZ that you own, right? That XYZ is XYZ that you have to pay back into the CDP anyway. And then when you pay back the XYZ, regardless of how much money that XYZ is worth, you're still getting your original ETH back, right? So basically what's happening here is we're using DeFi lending platforms as basically an obfuscated version of a wrapper contract. So there's a lot of these attacks that we can do, right, that are all pretty mean. And there's some examples of attacks happening in practice. So the attempted hostile takeover of Steam that happened earlier this year was very interesting. So as I briefly mentioned there, the story basically is that there was originally Steam, the company, and Steam, the company, had a fairly large amount of Steam tokens, but there was this kind of understanding with the community that those tokens are not really a kind of private property. Those tokens are meant to kind of develop and improve the Steam ecosystem. Then Justin Sun came along. He bought Steam, the company, without really having an understanding with Steam, the community. And then he basically started acting as though those coins that were meant to develop the network just completely belongs to him. The community was concerned that he would use these coins to start voting because like they felt like they had an understanding with the original owner that those coins were not meant to vote, but Justin just like started treating those coins as though they belonged to him. And so the community kind of voted to formalize their understanding and just make sure that those coins don't have voting rights. Justin then, what he did was he cooperated with exchanges, right? Like major cryptocurrency exchanges, Binance, like other ones. And he used coins that other people have deposited in order to like basically vote and take over the Steam network and ensure that he has all of the delegate slots. And so he has sort of secured control and he can do what he wants. So what happened there was interesting, right? Because if you think about coins that are sitting on exchanges, right? An exchange is actually like a wrapper contract. You have your XYZ, you deposit your XYZ on an exchange. You have a balance on the exchange, which is kind of like WXYZ. And the exchange does actually own the governance power. Like if the exchange is the one that, from the blockchain's point of view, owns the XYZ. And the exchange sometimes even pays dividends. Sometimes it pays real dividends to XYZ holders. And sometimes the exchange just kind of implicitly pays dividends because it provides XYZ holders with a valuable service, like the ability to easily trade their XYZ, do leverage with it, and other things like this, right? And then the exchange has this concentrated governance power. And in this case, basically the kind of exchange just decided to use it to cooperate with the attack. So This story has a happy ending, and I'll get to it soon. But this is just an example of how, like, these kinds of attacks that seem like they're almost kind of too evil to be true can actually be proved fairly real. And then bribes, staking pools. So staking pools that where you can basically deposit your coins, and a centralized operator has governance power, and then they give you interest. These things are common in many delegated proof of stake systems. So these kinds of economic attacks, they actually really do happen all the time, right? Now, there's of course people who try to philosophically argue, well, are they attacks? Isn't it just like basically like market activity and people selling things to the highest to the person who benefits most from them? I have a post. Like, I actually have multiple posts on my blog of Vitalik.ca where I talk about like why these kinds of things like really are attacks, and why they do break the economics of these platforms if they're just allowed to happen without restriction. So these kinds of things can happen, and in the long run, these kinds of things will happen, right? And these kinds of problems are a big deal, even without attacks. One major problem with coin voting is just that it becomes very plutocratic. So this was an image that was made by a critic of the DAO fork about 4 years ago, where he pointed out that one of the on-chain votes that was done to legitimize the DAO fork, like basically there were not that many people participating, and the distribution of people participating was fairly unbalanced, right? So there's one voter who actually had about like 20% of the entire voting power in the vote. And so you can ask, well, how decentralized is it when some people have like tens of thousands of times more voice than other participants? And I argue in my blog posts that I mentioned on vitalik.ca that these problems are hard to solve, right? Like, there is very deep and fundamental economic reasons that have to do with the difference between private goods and public goods, with kind of coordination, how public resources work, and the conclusion of this research basically is that like these are not problems that you can just solve with a very small number of tweaks, right? These are problems that are very fundamental problems, and they require very fundamental solutions. So there's two kinds of solutions that I tend to favor, right? So the first kind of solution is going beyond coin voting as a form of governance. So in the Ethereum community, we have been doing this experiment on Gitcoin grants, where we've been using quadratic funding as a way of funding public goods within the Ethereum ecosystem. Quadratic funding, and once again, I talk about it on my blog. I have talked about it in many other places. It's a form of governance that combines together kind of donations and economic value with a notion of identity and counting individual contributors to try to create a more optimal and more fair result for which projects get how much funding, right? So quadratic funding takes identity into account. It treats one person with giving $1,000 differently from 1,000 people each giving $1. These things, and here we've been doing many rounds of this Gitcoin grants. These are some of the most recent results, and it actually has been doing a very successful job of funding the public goods that the Ethereum ecosystem considers to be the most valuable. Now, one very important thing is that these quadratic funding mechanisms and these other non-coin based and more identity-based voting systems, they rely on some notion of unique human identity, right? And there's the question of, well, in a blockchain context, how do you even tell who is a unique human and who is not? And now there are, of course, centralized versions of this. There's phone number verification, there's KYC and all of this stuff. There's been some interesting projects in the Ethereum ecosystem or close to the Ethereum ecosystem that have been trying to do decentralized forms of verification. So there's Circles, which is this coin that gives a universal basic income to everyone who has an account. There's Bright ID. Both of these systems rely on some kind of social network kind of analysis where people verify each other. Um, I recommend you and encourage you to kind of go out and look at both of them. So these are both making a lot of progress. And solution two is skin in the game, right? So going back to why governance is vulnerable to bribes and why governance breaks, the problem is basically that if you have 0.01% of the coins, then you only suffer 0.01% of the consequences of your own decision, right? Like your own vote has some effect on governance, and if that effect is a negative effect, then that effect is felt by all participants in the ecosystem, where you are only 0.01% of them, right? And so the reason why this kind of governance breaks is because you have this imbalance where if someone bribes you, then you get the full benefit of the bribe, but because everyone kind of goes down together, you only suffer a small portion of the negative consequences of you voting for something bad. So I told you that the Steam story has a happy ending, right? So here is the happy ending. The Steam community came together and rebelled. They made this a new blockchain called Hive, which is basically a hard fork of Steam. And what they did is they basically said the Hive starts out with the supply being forked from like basically the Steam blockchain. But then what they say is that stake that participated in the attack on Steam, so basically coins that voted a lot in favor of the hostile takeover, were excluded from the initial distribution. So basically, if you voted for an attack and the community forks away from the attack, then your coins get burned, right? And the Hive white paper really nicely actually cited some work that myself and some other Ethereum researchers did, where we talked about the concept of slashing, and it kind of is similar to slashing in a lot of ways. Right, so the challenge here is basically, can we create these governance mechanisms where instead of a vote being just a vote, where if you vote for something bad, the bad consequences are felt by everyone, can we turn it into something more individually accountable, where if you vote for a bad decision and that bad decision leads to something bad happening to the network, then you suffer, but people who voted against that decision do not suffer. And I mean, prediction markets are one example of something that works in this way. There's a large space of governance mechanisms that have this property. And so, this is another kind of path that we can look into. So conclusions. So experimentation into decentralized governance is important. And this is because funding public goods is important. Funding public goods is this next big thing that the crypto ecosystem needs to really learn how to do. Attacks are a problem. Decentralized governance is easy to attack. Wealth concentration leading to power concentration is also a problem. And we need some new ideas to move forward. And we have some new ideas. And I want to welcome different projects and of experimenting and trying new techniques at moving forward and coming up with better models. So thank you.
Thank you, Vitalik. Thank you for adding these Chinese subtitles, which is really sweet. And I personally really like the idea of quadratic funding. Yeah, I think it's this kind of great experiments in the Ethereum that makes this ecosystem really attractive. So do you personally firmly believe that decentralized governance will be the ultimate state for all blockchain projects?
That's a very good question. I think and there is a limit to like how much we can trust a governance system, even if we really like it. And so I think one thing that's very possible is that kind of base layer protocols and things that are perceived to be just very systemically important to everything else. So like, for example, the Bitcoin blockchain and the Ethereum blockchain are maybe even the only two. May end up surviving without base layer governance, just because if you want to have base layer governance, then you need to create either an imperfect system or you need to start incorporating identity into the base layer, and it starts getting very hairy. But layer 2 protocols are, I think, the most important ones definitely are going to have decentralized governance of some form. I think like a lot of these are. I think a lot of these roll-up projects are going to have decentralized governance just as a way of directing the revenue that they get from like MEV auctions and fees, for example. I mean, we've seen that like Uni has a DAO. These stablecoin projects have a DAO of some form. So I definitely think that these kinds of DAOs will continue to exist and be developed. But I definitely do see it as being kind of, if something is very, very important, then it will probably have no governance or no on-chain governance and move towards stability over time. If something is closer to the middle of the stack, we will see many kinds of decentralized governance. And things closer to kind of the top of the stack will either be DAOs or even be more centralized, because at higher levels of the stack, centralization is okay. It depends on the context.
Yeah, we're also very looking forward to seeing more progress on decentralized governance. Yeah, and I remember you mentioned that you wish to do a presentation in Chinese maybe one day, right?
Mm.
Yeah, so maybe can I book your first Chinese presentation maybe for our next event?
I mean, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, see
Thank
you.
you. 谢谢大家。拜拜。
大家掌声鼓励一下，谢谢 Vitalik。OK， 好，那说到今年，我们说是 DeFi 的元年。如果说让大家选择一个关键词的话，大家会选择哪个关键词呢？大家可以说出来让我知道。